You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 15th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Slovakia's Prime Minister wounded in assassination attempt. How warm a welcome can Vladimir Putin expect in Beijing, and how the UK's government wastes taxpayers' time as well as their money. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel, Hilton and Sean Ryan will discuss the day's big stories and will be at the release of the latest Chandler Good Government Index, which is like Eurovision for grown-ups. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and by Sean Ryan, director of media at Save the Children, former Sunday Times foreign editor. Hello to you both.
Andrew.
Isabel, I understand you have recently, as recently as today, in fact, been attending a conclave of serious grown-up journalists.
I am hot foot from the biggest gathering of investigative journalists, organised in memory of the former editor, the late editor of the Sunday Times, Harry Evans, who was the great patron of investigative journalism. And this is the second, I guess it's now probably going to be annual, gathering of hacks talking about the lamentable state of the media and the difficulties of doing investigative journalism, and some very, very powerful testimonies from Gaza, from all over the world, actually.
Lamenting the state of the media is, of course, a preoccupation of journalists, verging on a hobby. In fact, Sean, you have, however, recently descended from altogether more peaceable climes.
I've been lying on the sofa in the Highlands for the last week. It's not very interesting to talk about. I ate a bag of crisps. I looked at a loch. I had some lovely dinners and drinks. It was my wedding anniversary. I'm entitled.
Oh, well, congratulations. And can I just say it is lovely to have somebody so comprehensively out of touch appearing on a topical news discussion programme. We will hear more from you both shortly, but first we are going to Slovakia, where Prime Minister Robert Fico is reported to be in a life-threatening condition following an assassination attempt this afternoon. Fico was shot several times as he left a government meeting in Handlover. A suspect has been detained at the scene. And I'm joined first of all by Lucia Virotskova, a journalist based in Slovakia. Lucia, what is the latest we are hearing on the Prime Minister's condition?
Hello, greetings to you from Slovakia. So obviously the information on Mr. Fico's health has been embargoed, but there is some information that there's been an operation. The most critical situation is around his stomach pain and hurt, but also his left arm has been hurt. He has been taken to the hospital in Banská Bystrica, as there wasn't time enough to take him to Bratislava with the main hospitals because of the condition that he was in, and we don't know much else. We're still expecting some information from the Ministry of Health.
Have we had any details released from police on about the suspect? Do we know who that is yet?
There's a lot of information on the social media, and the Slovak media are reporting a lot on this person. Apparently, it's a writer, amateur writer, a 71-year-old man from Levice, which is a small town close to Handlova, where this assassination attempt happened. One media, Aktuality.sk, talked to his son. He told them that he was not a voter of Mr. Fico, but he was also not someone who would be really hateful toward him or something. He was critical toward him, but it was a big surprise to his son that something like that happened. He fired 5 times with a legally held gun. So it's it came as quite a surprise, because in the past he even signed a protest against violence and wrote articles against violence. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of speculation on the social media and in the media about his motives.
Have we heard as yet from President Kaputova?
Yeah, President Chaputova, she condemned this attack, just like all the politicians, and she really asked all the politicians to stop with the aggressive rhetoric that has been in Slovak public sphere for quite some time, and that's basically what we hear a lot. That it could be the result of this polarization of the Slovak policy, of the aggressive political rhetoric, and so Chaputova, she really called on all the politicians to stop with that, because we don't want to see the attacks like this happening in Slovakia.
I mean, President Chaputova and Prime Minister Fico are, of course, very far from being allies. Have we heard anything as yet from the Prime Minister's allies? Are they seeking to direct blame in any direction, or are they also trying to calm things down?
Yeah, the first reactions were actually of this kind, really. They were trying to blame this on not only their political opponents, the opposition parties, but also on the media, on journalists, and on all the critics of the coalition parties. In fact, one of the opposition parties, the strongest opposition party, Progressive Party, which basically was originally also the party from which President Chaputova came, was originally planning to hold a demonstration today against a government plan to overhaul the public broadcast, public TV and radio. And of course, after this attack happened, they canceled the protest. But obviously, these politicians are now pointing to them and referring to them and criticizing the opposition of sparking all this criticism.
I mean, this is obviously going to be a huge story in Slovakia. Well, it's a huge story all over the world. And I guess in Slovakia, it's hard to imagine what a bigger story would be. But what sense are you getting of how Slovakia's media is going to cover this?
Well, it's been a shock. The Slovak media are quite, or we could say, major part of the Slovak media is quite critical of politicians in general. All the politicians, all the ruling politicians are always complaining that the media outlets are critical. So I guess that. But the first reaction is shock, and there's a lot of there are a lot of calls for against violence and all the even the most critical media and their editors have asked the public to really abstain from violence and violent rhetoric. So they want to make sure that despite their criticism of the government policies, they would never support attacks like this.
Lucia Virotskova, thank you very much for joining us. We will, of course, be following that story on all our shows across Monocle Radio tomorrow, beginning with The Globalist. But for the moment, let's bring our panel in. And Sean, first of all, this line which has emerged from President Chaputova and elsewhere that at some level rancorous, divisive, partisan political rhetoric can have this sort of effect. Is that something that we should take seriously? Should all political discourse be adjusted to the sensibilities of the most unbalanced person who may happen to hear it?
No. It's tragic, but it's much better that this was somebody who appears to have been an eccentric person than it would have been to have had him shot for political reasons. So this Prime Minister is a populist. He's centre-left in his politics, having started out in the Communist Party. He has said that he would not send a single piece of ammunition to Ukraine. He's courted controversy in various ways, but that appears not to have been the reason for the attack on him. I think it's always the case that when you get violence, there will be people saying, we need to calm this down. We need to calm it down rather than inflame the situation. And perhaps that's what the president is referring to. But she also described this as an attack on democracy at the outset, when I think we didn't really understand the nature of the attack.
And Isabel, a thought from you on this, and again, it's a variant on the same question. Is there a concern about the radicalisation of people, possibly even unhinged individuals? And I am making an assumption here that, you know, this person may have been an ardent consumer of social media, because it is hard to avoid noticing, even in countries which used to pride themselves on a relatively placid politics, like, for example, this one, which has seen 2 members of its parliament assassinated within the last decade, that something has shifted, hasn't it?
Something would appear to have shifted, but I also think that we need to watch what is done with this very shocking event, or what the aftermath is going to be, because among the things that have shifted, and have shifted partly as a result of Fico's style of politics, is that there isn't a willingness to accept truth or reality, or this may be an unhinged individual staging a shocking assassination attempt. But I would bet my firstborn that within minutes there will be conspiracy theories. He is a Russian, he's a Russophile, so the Americans have done it. And on and on and on, and we will then be in a morass of conflicting beliefs and people who can no longer agree a shared reality, and that is very dangerous for democracy.
I can confirm, Isabel, that morass is already congealing and began doing so within minutes of the news breaking. As I said, we will, of course, be covering this story across all our shows tomorrow and throughout the week. But now to Beijing, as indeed Russian President Vladimir Putin will be shortly. Before embarking, Putin exulted in what he described as unprecedented levels of cooperation between Russia and China, though it is an open question whether China's President Xi Jinping is still quite so enthusiastic. It seems in many respects rather longer than 2 years since Putin visited Xi in February 2022, pitched him on the idea of a 72-hour lightning conquest of Ukraine, and received the promise of a no-limits friendship. Isabel, first of all, as this is very much your bailiwick, how would you say Xi and Putin are getting on these days?
Well, I think actually they're getting on okay.
That's distressing.
I'm afraid it is. And certainly, I think a year after the invasion there was more doubt about this. But since then we've seen a consolidated Chinese effort to support Putin in so many ways, not just taking huge amounts of oil, quite a lot of gas, but also giving political and diplomatic cover and supplying, there's this great spike in mysterious trade through Central Asia of dual-use technology. And given that one of the secrets of the current success on the battlefield of the Russian troops is that they've got smarter, and their application of technology has become more sophisticated. It's a bit of a stretch to think that the Chinese contribution is entirely unrelated to that. Added to which, there was the famous moment when Xi Jinping was parting from Putin in Moscow last year, when he was overheard to say, we are remaking the world together, and we essentially see it in the same way. And everything that China has proposed since then, can be read as part of that shared effort to rewrite the global rules and to diminish Western influence and to elevate Russian or Chinese influence. It's, as a project, it's not going badly. It's going badly in Europe for Xi Jinping, but at the same time we can see the effects of Russian disruption and disinformation in Europe, and the fragmentation of politics, the cultivation of Orban, who can be relied upon to veto both in NATO and in the European Union. So, as an operation, it's been distressingly successful.
Sean, nevertheless, was there a certain amount of anxiety detectable in Putin's pre-flight oration? He was banging on about his love of martial arts, Chinese philosophy, saying his family are learning Mandarin, basically did everything except say he was a massive fan of beef in black bean sauce. Is he a little bit concerned?
Just a little. I think there's a lot more in this relationship for Putin than for Xi, although, as Isabel says, both want to disrupt the global order and resist the Western definitions of democracy and human rights and so on. But this relationship has changed hugely in the last 20 years as China has become the world's second biggest economy. It used to be that Russia was the dominant partner. Now it's very much China. And what Putin can get out of this is some counter to the isolation that invading Ukraine has intensified, and possibly some help with weapons from China as well. Although he will also have to be aware that as the second largest economy in the world, it's really not in China's interest to have any sort of global destabilization, economic particularly. And so China will not want this war to spread and intensify and be too much prolonged.
Well, indeed, Isabel, Xi has lit upon a formulation for China's response to Russia's Ukrainian invasion, and we did hear it during his recent visit to Europe, where he visited France and, curiously, Serbia. When he talked about the Ukrainian crisis, he said China is neither the creator of the crisis, not a party to it, or a participant. Is he sort of saying there, or could you hear him saying there, that China does just kind of wish this would stop?
Well, China, if you remember, put forward what it called a 12-point peace plan more than a year ago. And it was pretty much a set of bullet points rather than a plan, not buttressed by the kind of diplomatic activity you need to get a plan going. And everything that they have called for has pretty much been to the Russian advantage. So let's have a ceasefire now, let's stop fighting, let's play nicely, but nothing about Russia withdrawing. They've never actually condemned the invasion. They purport to uphold the UN principle of territorial integrity, and this seems to me a bit of a breach of that principle. China has never said so. So I think that insofar as there is a Beijing game plan, it is to wait possibly till after the US election, at which point future, if Trump gets back, obviously future support for Ukraine is very much in doubt. And then to rely on a sufficient tilt to the right in Europe that a kind of complication and weariness will set in Europe about Ukraine, and then to say, look, we can help broker a peace, and the peace would essentially leave Russia with the gains that it has, and pressure on Ukraine to just take what you can get at this point. I suspect if China were to be proactive, that would be the game that it would try to play.
And or Sean, just finally on this, is there any possibility that China might be tempted to usher Russia and Putin under the bus if they thought it might lead to a more profitable, if not necessarily a friendlier relationship with the United States? Because Russia is not one of the world's great economies, despite what Russia may think. As it was, Chinese exports to Russia were down 14% year on year. You would rather be doing business with the United States if you had to make a choice, wouldn't you?
Well, you would. And China has been quite susceptible to persuasion from the Americans and the Germans over questions such as the possible use of nukes in Ukraine by Russia. China has bent to the Western will in terms of intervening with Russia on those things. But on the other hand, China will not throw Russia under the bus, because that would destroy the project that we've been discussing, which is to disrupt the global order. And that's the bigger picture that China is looking for. That's why it's so active in Africa and so active in Latin America. It's wanting to have this global influence and really reshape the world away from the creations of America and the West.
Well, let's now sort out the Middle East. How hard can that be, etc.? It is now more more than 7 months since Israel commenced operations in Gaza following the Hamas massacres of October 7th. Israel has been clear that its objective is the elimination of Hamas. Its responses to the follow-up of "and then what" have been less transparent. However, some Arab nations have been giving thought to what post-war Gaza might look like. The quintet of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates and Jordan are apparently willing to invest political and actual capital, but are seeking assurances that this will pave the path to a genuine two-state solution. Isabel, first of all, it's notable to me at least that all of these countries are talking very firmly about the Palestinian Authority, such as it is, being the next government of Gaza. It's been an unspoken subtext to this whole thing that across the Arab world, certainly in terms of the Arab governments, nobody at all cares about Hamas, do they? Not one of these governments is in the least bit disturbed about the idea of Hamas getting stomped.
There were two great supporters of Hamas historically. One was Iran and the other was Netanyahu. Netanyahu built up Hamas in order not to have to deal with the more reasonable Palestinian authorities. So, that's one of the many ironies about of the Middle East. And yeah, this group is definitely looking for a more stable and feasible political solution. Which you would not look for at Hamas for that.
I mean, one possible part of that stability and that solution, Sean, has been the idea of some sort of Arab peacekeeping force being deployed to Gaza. It is important to note that Jordan and the UAE have been very quick out of the blocks to say not in a million years or words to that effect. But is it necessarily that terrible an idea? I mean, somebody is going to have to provide security in Gaza when this is finished. And if we assume that Hamas will be in no state to do it, it's hard to imagine that the Palestinian Authority is. Certainly, I don't think it's something the IDF can be thought of as doing in the long term. Someone's going to have to go.
It's very difficult to look ahead, isn't it? But there are so many possibilities, and all of them have tremendous downsides. So the Palestinian Authority, not really up to it as things stand, you wouldn't have thought. The Americans not remotely interested in boots on the ground.
Absolutely.
The Israelis talk about staying on, and if they did, that would presumably lead to some sort of low-level guerrilla war at the very least, if they were to stay there for years. And in the meantime, if the Egyptians and the Moroccans and the Saudis and others are not willing to do this, then it's very hard to see a way forward. They might be willing to do it in return for a huge negotiated settlement of a Palestinian state. If that were to be held out as the great prize at the end of all this, it's possible that their involvement could be negotiated on the ground. But as a humanitarian organisation, that we're just very, very anxious about what's coming next, because it looks as if Rafah could face the same fate as other towns in Gaza, and it looks as if, with 37 million tons of rubble to be extracted, which one UN official said would take 14 years, and all the unexploded ordnance are within that rubble, you can just see what an enormous task lies ahead for everybody. So there's the political side, but there's also how do you look after the people on the ground?
But just to follow that up, Sean, because this is obviously a very real question to an organisation like yours. It's very difficult, verging on impossible, for any NGO to function anywhere there is no order at all. What kind of level of security, or what kind of, guarantee is the wrong word, but you know what I'm saying, before you are actually able with a clear conscience to send people in?
Well, Save the Children does have people still on the ground who have been very reluctant to leave indeed, and I'm sure that's the case with other NGOs as well. So they are doing what they can, but we've had to move our centre from Rafah itself out to a hospital on the coast, which is in one of these areas that the Israelis say will be safe, and we'll have to see how that goes. But we did have a baby born in our little hospital there the other day, the first baby to be born, so that's a little bit of hope for people. When you look at the broader picture, you've got hundreds of thousands of people with nowhere to go, no prospect of going back to their homes in the north, and they're being shoved into smaller and smaller areas in the south. So if Israel achieves its objectives in Rafah and then decides that that's the peak of its operation and it can now start to withdraw, they're obviously going to leave an almighty mess behind, and it's going to be it's going to be easier in some ways for organisations like the one I work for to get aid in, to get the access that you need at the moment if bombardments stop. But on the other hand, you're going to need trillions of dollars, and that's not something that any single agency can do. It's going to have to be a concerted effort by the international community.
Isabel, just finally on this one, given that the situation in Gaza, as Sean has just described, is incredibly bleak and is probably going to get bleaker, do you yourself have any of this optimism that people, this Arab quintet and others, are trying to cultivate, that maybe out the end of this there is a renewed focus on the idea of a long-term settlement, and that possibly out of this disaster a plausible two-state solution could emerge?
Yes. I mean, I think that sometimes to break a deadlock, you have to have a hideously traumatic event, and they don't become much more hideous and traumatic than this one.
No.
I mean, it took World War II to give us, the post-war order. So it is. I mean, it is the cliche about crises that they do break logjams, and if you can seize the moment and create the opportunity, then the opportunity is there. There are a lot of doubts, however, not least the US election. Who is going to be in charge? What will the United States do with this offer? But I mean, you can see, looking at the lineup of the Arab states involved. I mean, I can imagine Jordan and Egypt supplying security personnel, countries with smaller treasuries, while the others put in, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and UAE putting in funding to try to rebuild Gaza in order to at least have some peace and stability in the region. And that would be that's a radically different moment from what we had before all this started, which was the Palestinians essentially being sidelined, with a series of diplomatic moves, and the problem sort of not being looked at anymore. And clearly we are now looking at it very hard.
Well, here in the UK, however our taxes are being spent, it is not on telephone operatives for His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. A new report by the National Audit Office suggested that taxpayers calling HMRC in 2022 to 23 lost a total of 800 years on hold. In the year to February 2024, the average waiting time was circa 23 minutes, and only 67% of calls were eventually answered at all. These statistics do not measure the number of people who did eventually get through, interacted with some poorly trained, unmotivated, uninterested clock puncher, and spent some hours being sent around in circles before having an aneurysm or moving to Switzerland. Sean, first of all, to establish a benchmark here, what has been your worst ever on-hold experience?
Well, I'm not surprised that this 800 years figure has come up, because I have spent 800 years trying to get an appointment with a GP. And my worst experience is when you're told at the beginning you're 17th in the queue, and then you think, well, I can't be bothered, and then you think, well, actually, no, I can just wait and get some work done while I'm waiting for the numbers to go down. And then you get to first in the queue and you get through to somebody, and then they just cut you off, presumably accidentally. But that has happened to me, and that was probably the last time I swore really loudly at the top of my voice. But my favourite story about terrible customer service was a 91-year-old widow who tried to
she was
get
only
her account
45 when she first called.
She was trying to get her joint account changed because her husband had died, and the bank froze her account, and then she couldn't pay her electricity bill, and she was cut off, and then her phone was cut off, and then she took 2 buses to get down to the nearest branch, because they tend to be quite difficult to find these days, only to be told by the staff that she was in fact dead.
I am going to rise heroically above abusing this influential platform to name and shame, but I would like to say a big hello to all our listeners at Virgin Media. Isabel, Sean mentions swearing there. I was wondering, I was wondering if you have a particular tactic for dealing with on-hold situations. And I do have one, which I suspect you'll enjoy, because I have done this more than once. I'm not making it up. It has been my experience of living in this country that inside every impenetrable bureaucratic organisation where you don't think anything can ever get done, there is a Scottish woman. And if you can find her,
she'll sort it out.
It will get fixed in a matter of minutes. And I promise you, I'm not making this up. More than once in transports of exasperation, I have said, this is going to sound like a strange request, but is there a Scottish woman you can put me through to? And they have done it. And without exception that I can recall, it has worked in a matter of minutes.
Well, speaking as a Scottish woman, I have to say I'm not surprised, but it's a very hot tip. I mean, my personal favourites in recent experience are Virgin, of course, but BT and BA. But actually, by the time you get a telephone number at all, you've already done 3 days' work.
Well, indeed.
You know, because finding a number that is actually manned and personed and answered occasionally is already, a massive bit of fearsome investigation. The ones that annoy me are emails that they, issue some instruction which is inappropriate. I started getting from BA, I started getting everything in Spanish, which I happen to speak. But I don't really want to check in Spanish.
No one likes to show off, Isabel.
And I tried to get this corrected. It took days to get through to somebody who then clearly thought I was completely mad.
Sean, a question to which the answer is no. Are chatbots any improvement at all?
No.
Oh, they're worse. They give you the illusion.
They don't seem to understand your needs at all.
No, it's almost like they couldn't care less. I do have a solution to all of this, and I challenge either of you to tell me I'm wrong. I think, and the technology must exist, this must be doable. I refuse to believe that it's not. I'm a reasonable man. 5 minutes, fine. I don't mind waiting 5 minutes to talk to somebody. I understand that the people on the other end are busy dealing with other querulous customers such as myself who probably just don't understand the thing they're trying to interact with. But I think after 5 minutes, every minute they keep you on hold, the company should be fined and you should get the money. £1 a minute, I reckon.
But aren't you infuriated by the recordings that say we are experiencing an unusually high volume of calls at this moment, and you know they're not. That's the standard
and even if they are, I have more than once seethed back at that. That's your problem.
Yes, hire more people. Yeah. And the poor people, when you finally do get through to them and you're so enraged that it's very hard to be polite, and that's tough on them. And they also have scripts saying, I'm very sorry to hear about your experience.
They're not.
No, of course they're not.
And why should they be? But seriously, fine the companies £1 a minute. Make them pay for it.
I love that idea. It would really upset the Scottish woman, though, wouldn't it? Sorry for that cliché, Isabel, but there you are. I once read that Scottish women's voices are the most trusted by consumers, according to some marketing survey that may or may not be true. You've explained why that is, Andrew.
That's the reason.
They're good.
They're the only people in this country who have any idea how anything works. I am convinced of this. And on that advertisement for Scottish women, Isabel Hilton, Scottish woman, and Sean Ryan, not. Thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, if the recent bedlam at Eurovision proves anything, and let's face it, it doesn't, it's that we all love a big battle of nations. The Singaporean-based think tank Chandler Institute of Governance have just released the rankings of another such joust with the 4th edition of their Chandler Good Government Index. Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid headed down to a busy launch event at RUSI in London and spoke to the Institute's Managing Director for Research and Strategy, Kenneth Sim. Gunnar began by asking what the index hopes to measure and why its results should matter to state leaders.
Well, we started with a very simple but important question, which is that what capabilities do governments need to deliver better outcomes for its people? And how do we measure that? So the CGGI is exactly that. It's a diagnostic tool that measures the capabilities and the effectiveness of governments across 35 different indicators. We cover 113 countries all over the world, accounting for 90% of the world's population. This also makes us the most comprehensive index of its kind.
And now to start with a bit of a bird's eye view, looking at all these countries as a whole, what are some of the trends that we're seeing now? Because you mentioned, for example, that despite people's rankings in the index, that doesn't necessarily reflect people's trust in their government.
I think trust in government is a worrying and extremely pernicious trend. There has been, in the best case scenario, staying constant, but in the worst case scenario, drastic slide in trust in government. And part of the reason why I think is because governments need to mean what they say, and they need to do what they say they do. Capabilities is central to that. Whether they can do it and deliver the outcomes that they say they will deliver is fundamental to trust in government.
And then in terms of that capability, one of the big things that you're pointing out now is that there seems to be a widening performance gap between these countries. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So this is something that didn't surprise me, but the extent of the bifurcation surprised me. What we are seeing today is first that there are more countries that have declined on the index, declined in performance on the index, than there are countries that have improved. Within those that have improved and declined, we find that the top performers and the top improvers have actually become even better. And the top decliners have become even weaker in performance. The same pattern repeats itself when we look at regional countries at the regional level. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which are already not doing too well relative to other regions, have continued to decline in performance over the last few years. So overall, what we are seeing is a wider bifurcation, with the good getting better and the poorer becoming poorer.
And when you look at those states that are excelling, who are in the top 10, who are in the top 20, is that changing at all, or is it staying relatively the same?
In the top 10 and 20, there is some churn, some movements here and there, but by and large, I would say that the movements are not great. And the part of the reason is simply that, I think, that capabilities take a long time to build, and hopefully the converse is also true. Capabilities take a long time to get eroded. Having said that, there were a few countries that performed very, very well. One of them is the UAE, which has moved up 6 notches this year to 14th place. And another is Greece. Greece, although it's not in the top 20, is one of the biggest, in fact, it is the biggest improvers in terms of CGGI score over the last 4 years. On the converse end, there are also countries that have declined significantly. One example is Russia, which has dropped 12 notches from last year to this year.
And another focus of your index this year is sort of moving away from the focus on crisis and dealing with the COVID pandemic of previous years to now being more future-facing. How do we solve the future problems? And you highlighted 4 major challenges for the future that governments are going to face. Can you speak to that?
So in this year's index report, we investigate how good governments are also being better prepared or not being better prepared for future challenges. What we did was we looked at the correlations between CGGI performance for countries and the country's performance in other indices that measure, for example, the ability to create the conditions for peace, their ability to attract, retain and develop talent, their ability to prepare for the countries for AI, and their ability to adapt to environmental threats. And in these 4 areas, we found a strong correlation between countries' performance in the CGGI and the respective indices.
And now, finally, the Chandler Institute doesn't just produce this index, it also tries to directly engage with government leaders around the world. How have you actually found speaking and engaging with state leaders? Do they actually listen?
It's funny that you asked this question. So the answer is yes, they do listen, but the reactions come in very different ways. So for example, today, when I mentioned that the UK was placed 11, there was an audible gasp in the room. I think people were surprised and they thought, there is no way the UK is that high. But in some other countries, I get the opposite reaction. And I say, there is no way I'm doing that low. There must be something wrong with your data. So I think the answer is yes, they do listen. In fact, I'm glad that they do, because one of the purpose of the CGGI is to be a tool for self-reflection for governments all across the world and a conversation starter on where to go next in building capabilities.
Kenneth Sim from the Chandler Institute of Governance in conversation with Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel, Hilton and Sean Ryan. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.